In our previous story of last week, we read that David was chosen by Yahweh for something special, but nobody, except the prophet Samuel and Yahweh, knew what the secret was. When David was a young shepherd boy, King Saul reigned in Israel. King Saul had many troubles and worries, because the spirit of Yahweh was not with him anymore, and that made the king sad and unhappy. King Saul's servants suggested that he gets a musician to come to the palace to play for the king to make him feel better. So the king agreed, and he told his servants to get such a man that can make good music with a harp, and bring him to the palace to play before him. One of the servants told the king that he knew that Jesse had a strong and brave young son, because he protected his dad's sheep. He could also play the harp very well. And this young boy was also wise. He made good decisions, because the spirit of Yahweh was with him. He would be the one that can make good and pleasant music for the king. Then the king sent his servants to fetch this young boy. This boy was the youngest son of Jesse's 8 sons. Can you remember this young boy's name from last week? Yes, his name was David, the shepherd boy who could play the harp well and was very able and fast with a sling. So David's dad packed a leather bag for him with loaves of bread, grape juice, and meat. He placed it on the back of a donkey and sent David and the donkey to King Saul. When David stood before King Saul, the king saw David and immediately liked him. He liked him so much that he asked David's dad to let him stay in the palace. He gave David a very important job. David will carry the king's armor. Whenever King Saul was sad and unhappy, David would take out his harp and play soft, beautiful melodies that made the king feel much better. King Saul and David stayed in the land of Israel, and they were called Israelites. Next to them, in the land of the Philistines, there was a king who did not like the Israelites and wanted to fight and make war on the Israelites. This king of the Philistines had a large army of soldiers, and they wanted to take the land of Israel away from King Saul. King Saul also had an army. One day, the Philistines went to make war against the Israelites. The Philistines went up a mountain and stood on one side of the mountain. The Israelites also went up the mountain, opposite the Philistines, and looked at them. There was a valley between the two mountains. Now the Philistines had a champion fighter named Goliath. Goliath was a very, very tall man. He was taller than a big, tall tree, taller than the roof of a house in Israel. He was a giant. He had a very long spear made of iron. His armor was so heavy that 4 men had to carry his shield to the battlefield. Goliath stood on the mountain and shouted at the army of King Saul that they must come to fight with him, if they dare. This giant shouted and shouted that he will beat all of King Saul's men and take their land and their wives and children away from them. Goliath saw the army of King Saul was very afraid of him. Goliath kept shouting and shouting that they must send a strong soldier to come and fight with him. And if this strong soldier of King Saul's army beats him, the Philistines will leave the land of Israel. But if Goliath beats the Israelite soldier, then the Israelites must work as slaves to the Philistines, and they will take their land and their wives and their children away. King Saul was afraid of the giant. He did not want to fight against the giant. The 3 oldest brothers of David were also in the army of King Saul. They were also very afraid of the giant Goliath. They also did not want to fight against the giant. David went to visit his dad Jesse on the farm to see if his flock of sheep and lambs are healthy and safe. David's dad asked him to take food for his 3 brothers that were on the battlefield down in the valley. They served in King Saul's army. So when David came closer with the food to the battlefield, he heard the giant Goliath shouting at the army of King Saul. The army of King Saul was so afraid of the giant that they ran away. David spoke to all the men in the army of King Saul and asked them, why are they afraid of this giant? The men believed that this giant will beat all of them and take their land and wives and children. David told them that they should not be afraid, that Yahweh was with them, protecting them. But the men were very afraid. Then David went to King Saul to tell him that he is brave and strong. He told King Saul that he protected the flock of sheep and lambs against jackals, wolves, bears, and also against lions, and that he is not afraid. David told King Saul that he is willing to fight against the giant. He said to the king that he is not afraid because Yahweh will be coming with him to the battlefield. So today we read and listened that David was not afraid of the giant because Yahweh's spirit was with him. He was with him when he protected the flock of sheep and lambs, and David believed that Yahweh will again be with him on the battlefield. So next week we will continue to find out what happened on the battlefield between David and Goliath, and also find out a little bit more about the secret that only the prophet Samuel and Yahweh knew. Children, have a good day and a peaceful Shabbat, as the Shabbat will be coming around every week. Yom Tov, Shabbat Shalom.